Happy Friday, everybody, and welcome to the AP Town Hall, our monthly forum for information for audio production students here at Full Sail University. My name is John Curtis. I am the course director for Advanced Mixing Techniques. Joining me today is Matt Davis, who is the associate course director for Mixing Techniques, our sister course, also in AP. Also joining us today is Rick Palmer. He is the course director for Project and Portfolio 5, and he's also joined by Derek Harvin, who's the course director for Project and Portfolio 7. We'll be taking your questions after we talk about our main topic today. So both Rick and Derek will be handling the questions. We'd like to thank them for that. So what are we talking about today? We want to talk about mixing, since both Matt and I handle mixing 14 months apart, which is quite a long time for most of you out there. We wanted to talk about some of just the basics, how to get started, some strategies, some tips and tricks, and hopefully some things that whether you're at the beginning of the program or even approaching the end, can help you not only with the courses here at Full Sail, but can just help you in general, okay? You ready?
I'm ready.
Let's do this. So, getting started and some strategies. The number one thing that I always tell my students is, well, probably the number two thing. We'll get to number one in a minute. Always, always, always check your documentation. You want to make sure that whatever comes in, whether it's a project from one of us or another course, or if you're working with somebody else, is to always check the documentation. You want to make sure that what you get is consistent, that all the files are there. But as you're getting ready to set up a mix, you want to make sure that you set up your DAW properly, right? You want to make sure that your sample rate and your bit depth are properly set so that everything is playing back the way it should. Also take a look for any other special considerations. Is there anything that was specifically requested by the last engineer or the producer or the artist themselves? Matt, did you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I see a lot of this in my classes, and we try and reinforce how important it is to have appropriate sample rate and bit depth for our sessions. I don't know if it's expressed, well enough, but so here's the rule of thumb. Maintain whatever sample rate you get in your mix parts. That's of paramount importance. When you sample rate convert something from the format that it comes in into another format, you get, conversion loss, which degrades the quality of the sound. You want to avoid that. There's no reason to do that without, a very good reason. Also, bit depth. I see this a lot here, and I see this a lot professionally from my clients that send me mixes to master. Always keep your bit depth as high as you can. I mean, it's not 1998 anymore. Hard drive space is dirt cheap.
Yeah.
Just, 24-bit minimum, 32-bit float, highly preferable. There's no reason to be mixing at 16-bit, and you shouldn't be getting work parts in at 16-bit from the tracking engineers.
Yeah, I mean, there's a possibility somebody could request 16-bit, but
as the format you send back to them, surely. If you're doing mastering, yes, we very diligently dither down to 16-bit in controlled environments, but that shouldn't be something that you apply to all of your mix parts up front, because it kind of cuts your legs off in terms of the functional dither floor, the headroom that you have to work with, and digital processors work better when they have more bit depth. So, err on the side of more so far as your bits go, and keep your sample rate where it started.
Yeah, and for every project here, it's going to be clearly laid out in the documentation what those file formats are at, both sample rate and bit depth. So, and you should be able to tell once on a first listen, you should go, whoa, something is really wrong here. It sounds slowed down or sped up. And if you hear that, you've got a problem immediately. So one thing too, if you can't find the documentation, whether it's from one of us, which is probably going to be pretty rare, ask questions, right? You can always ask this from whoever you got files from when you're out working in the real world as well. If you don't think you have adequate enough documentation, ask, right?
And on top of that, modern DAWs are really hand-holdy. If you try and import work parts at a different sample rate, it's going to say, hey, we noticed this is a different sample rate. Do you want to convert it? That should raise a red flag that you're heading down the wrong path.
Yeah, and even DAWs like Logic that will load in any sample rate.
They always ask.
Yeah, it will ask you too, but if you load in something at a different sample rate, it's now going to convert everything else to that new sample rate. So something to be aware of. Anything else you want to cover on this?
No, that about does it.
Pretty simple. Let's move
yeah.
on. All right. Starting a mix, and I think we talked about this, is probably something that a lot of students find pretty daunting, especially when you're looking at a lot of tracks. If you're working on your own material, I know what most people kind of mix as they go. It doesn't seem as big, and then suddenly you get, a file from one of us or a client file, and it's like, whoa, where did all these tracks come from, and what do I do with them? It can be kind of daunting to start off with, but really the simplest thing to do is just load them all up. Now, in your documentation, you may have some extra notes. We'll talk about that here in a second. But just load everything up. And I would say, for me personally, once everything is kind of loaded up, I kind of level things out because everything's going to play at the same volume, however it was recorded. I kind of pull the faders down a little bit and just give it a listen all the way through. It kind of gives you a feel for what the song is. That initial impression is always kind of everything. It can help you kind of develop the technique that you want to do with a mix, a particular style, or any ideas. It's just a great way to kind of immerse yourself in what's going on. This is obviously a good point to make sure that everything lines up properly, right? Now, most of what you will get here at Full Sail is probably going to be broadcast waves, so when you drop them into your DAW, it should line them up automatically. But I've encountered sessions where things
Sync issues.
drop at bar 1, and they really should be at bar 49 or some weird bar beat and tick. So hopefully you've gotten a rough mix from the client, and if that's the case, you may have to go back and A/B to that. But again, if something seems out of whack, a part or a verse or whatever, just seems like it shouldn't be happening in the right place, again, ask.
And on that note, tracking engineers, always consolidate your work parts before you export them.
Oh, please.
I've had some nightmare scenarios in my studio where that one simple keystroke wasn't done, and it resulted in hours of work for me to try and line up the mix parts with the rough mix.
Yeah.
Don't forget.
Yeah, I got to admit, it's been a while since I've seen anything like that, but it can happen. So
It
it's
only
just-
takes once.
It
to
only
ruin
takes
your
one.
week.
Pretty much. It can take, you're like, oh, I've got a plan for this. I know exactly how it's going to go. And then that guitar solo comes in at a really weird spot. And you're just like, is that supposed to be like this? All your plans are out the window. So one of the things I kind of mentioned before, again, hopefully in the documentation, there may be tracks that aren't going to be used. Even though everything was done in production, they may give you extra tracks, and they may be noted in the documentation of, hey, here's a rough vocal take that we don't want to use, we just left it in there, or here's an additional keyboard part or 20 that we were playing around with and we're not sure if we like them. So that's another thing to keep in mind too. You might be hearing additional parts that shouldn't be in there. So again, double check that documentation, and if it's not there, ask, right? So you want to make sure that what you're mixing is what the artist intended or what they would like to have mixed.
And conversely, depending on your relationship with the producer, you may find that there's a syllable or a word that they kind of beefed it on, but in the take that they weren't intending to use, it's brilliant,
Yeah.
and you can swap it in there. You can comp it in with the main take.
Yeah,
All depending.
Yeah, and typically things like that would probably be done in production, but
Hopefully, yeah.
you as a mix engineer or even a rough engineer can find something that the artist or even the producer didn't quite count on. Right?
It
That's where your
happens.
ears come in handy. So that kind of leads us to our next point. Are there any tracks or regions that need to be cleaned up? So anything that needs to be digitally dealt with. And there may be background noise, mic rumble, 60 cycle hum, even digital artifacts that could pop in there from editing. It's kind of rare, but it does happen. So one of the things typically that I will do with a mix, I mean, I'll give it a listen. I may actually listen to it all the way through 2 or 3 times, and then I start kind of going track by track and listening to that track all the way through to hear if there are any bad crossfades, if there are any artifacts in there that honestly can just be, consolidated out. You just like cut the region, either dump it, reduce the gain to 0, or take it down
Spectral
50.
repair.
Yeah, that can work too if you need to. But this is another way to make sure that what you're actually mixing is probably the best it can be. We could probably go into like, do you want to go nuts with
Yeah.
cleanup and quantization and whatnot? That might be a topic for
It's
another
real
time.
easy to throw the baby out with
Yeah,
the
it is.
bathwater if you aren't careful.
Yeah.
But building on that, on top of the more administrative things that you do during this stage of the process, I think it's really important in that first listen or two when it's super fresh in your mind. You haven't, become desensitized to the music yet. Kind of try and establish like, okay, what are the mechanics of the song itself, not the recording. What's the feature? What's the star of the show here? What's, carrying the emotional content of this music? What elements emphasize the upbeat? What elements emphasize the downbeat? What elements integrate with each other and play off of each other and have, a symbiosis between each other? What should be in the front of the soundstage? What should be in the back of the soundstage? A lot of questions that, if you listen to it for too long, you might stop listening to the music. So I like to think about these things up front while I'm doing the, janitorial duties up front.
Yeah, we didn't talk about it, but markers come in really handy for
yeah,
this.
big time.
Taking notes while doing all of this, it's kind of, it's on our sheets here. I'm not sure if I added it to the screen here, but I will take pretty copious notes while listening back for any issues that need to be cleaned up, or like you said, anything that, ooh, I really want to emphasize that particular part, that works really well, or really just about anything. But most DAWs have, marker capabilities where you can delineate not only, intro, breaks, verse, chorus, fade outs, codas, whatever, but they should have a notepad that's available where you can go in and keep your notes in there, which might be handy if you need to come back to the mix later. But yeah, take some notes while you're, going through it is a good idea to kind of get your process working as well. Anything else you want to add?
No, that's about it.
Cool. All right, so let's talk about putting it together at this point. Probably could go back to kind of listening a little bit, but it's probably a good idea to order your tracks, and we do talk about this a lot. So line everything up in your DAW, really whichever works for you as a mixer personally. I think most of us kind of follow the standard, drums, percussion, bass, guitar, keyboards, then maybe vocals, effects may come before the vocals. But get everything kind of laid out together so at least you know where everything is. Color coding is a good idea too. Color coding each individual section, so drums, percussion, can help you find things, especially when you're dealing with, I would say,
100 tracks.
well, I would say probably 20 tracks or more, maybe even less. I like color coding because immediately my eyes go to
Totally.
where I need to look to.
And there's an ergonomic factor too. I mean, that's one of the things that can make these things seem daunting when you're presented with a bunch of tracks is, oh, I heard a problem, where is that channel? And
Yeah.
it kills the whole session while you're fishing around trying to find this channel. But if you have like a regimen for the order that you always put your tracks in for a given genre of music, you have that to refer back to, and
Exactly.
it's intuitive.
Yeah. Grouping is a really good thing as well, and kind of at the stage while you're putting everything in order. Assigning groups is probably a smart thing too. I mean, the main reason is once you kind of get a group mix going, it's so much easier to grab one fader than multiple faders, especially if you have any kind of intricate automation going on. But you wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between, say, mixed groups
Yeah.
and subgroups, maybe what the difference is, which one might be better.
Yeah, they're not nearly so similar as you would think from the name. Mixed groups, I think, are more ergonomically driven. It's like you said, one mouse click and drag, you move the whole set of faders, which is great for balancing groups of elements up front when you're trying to establish your rough mix before finer tuning on the individual elements. It can really streamline that process. But subgroups are a much more practical thing later on in the process. Like I was saying, figure out which elements have a symbiosis between them, like the drums, right? Odds are you're probably going to want to glue them for cohesion. This is where subgroups come in. If you put a compressor on each channel separately, you aren't adding cohesion. But when you add just a little bit of it to that drum bus, you kind of unify it and make it start sounding like drums instead of drum stems, you know?
Yeah,
So.
it's a great point. Okay, we cool here? Right, let's move on. Levels, okay? I personally mix rather quiet. I like kind of a low mix. I will bring things up when I want to check at a certain point, but it's just trying to protect my ears and just the way I was trained years and years and years and years ago. But I always recommend kind of start low, mainly because you want some more headroom there, if need be. If all of your faders are right at 0 dB, yeah, you can go up positive. It's digital. We've got plenty of headroom to go, but again, you've got plenty of headroom at the bottom end of that spectrum as well. So why not kind of, meet in the middle, if you will? And we kind of came up with, probably get individual channels to around about -6 dB peak, either using clip gain or by a gain plugin on each channel, or if you're using a channel strip, right? Anyone will work. Make sure, by the way, if it's a gain plugin or a channel strip, that is the very first one in the chain, right? You don't want any other processing before that. But again, it's kind of whatever works best for you. Do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, I mean, in the pioneering days of digital, they said, oh, get it close to full scale. You got to get all those bits, But if you do what I said about bit depth, you aren't working at 16-bit. You're working at 24-bit or 32-bit float. And I mean, if you're at 32-bit float, okay, you can throw away 6 dB at the top of your headroom because you've got an extra 50 dB of mantissa bits that get applied to the bottom of your headroom. So you don't lose the bits, and it lets you build sensible gain staging in at the front end of your mix so you have some room for the mix to grow into, so you don't have to go back and pull things down after the fact.
Yeah,
and you don't have to worry about clipping your plugins either.
Yeah, and because most DAWs work at 32-bit float anyway, you've essentially got infinite gain. Yeah. So, even just having, at 24-bit, it's 144 dB of total dynamic range.
You really can give away 6
dB. Yeah, you can give away plenty, because truthfully, you're probably going to use 40 to 50 of that total of that 144 dB. You've got so much there you can work with. So you don't worry about level-wise. It's as easy as taking your reference monitor or headphone level up. Yeah, so you've got plenty of room to play around with. I did put a little tidbit in here. You might want to, if you're doing grouping, you might want to make sure those are adjusted as well so you have kind of room to go up as well. So something to keep in mind as well. All right. Some strategies, okay? Bottom up versus top down mixing. For those who've never heard these terms before, bottom up traditionally is building your foundation, which is drums and bass, and then you would probably build kind of the guitars and keys and whatever on top of that, with vocals being at the very top, vocals and backing vocals. Top down is doing that in reverse. You start off with the vocals and then pull everything up to that. And I mentioned in here that bottom up is kind of traditional. It's, for decades, it's kind of how almost every engineer has worked. With a fairly traditional track with drums, is you build the drums first, and you kind of bring the bass in, and then start building the elements on top of that. And it works for me, but it does take a little bit of work, especially if you like to work fairly loud. You'll find you run out of room really quickly, and everything keeps getting pushed up more and more and more and more to make room for the other elements. So if I encounter a project that has that, either from a student or rough mix, I'll recommend reversing it. Try a top down. You're going to wind up mixing a little bit lower, and it can help you kind of understand where everything fits together. Maybe gives you a little more balance. Then you can go back and kind of do a bottom-up approach to kind of get your loudness back. You can do it either way, but sometimes a top-down approach can help you figure out architecturally where everything is going to fit.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what the early innings of your mixing career should be. Once you understand, the core fundaments of what it entails and how to operate the tools that you use for it, that's the next thing, is figure out, okay, I know the technique, now what's my style? How do I define a style that works for me? And depending on what works for you best, you might start from the bottom up, get your drums straight, add the bass, get them working, and work your way up. Or maybe you want to focus on the melodic elements and work your way down. I mean, that's kind of the really cool thing about mixing compared to most of the other branches of audio, is how much latitude there is for defining your own style. The fact that there's really weird variants out there, like Michael Brower's technique and the way Chris Lord-Alge sets up his mixes, is a real statement to how much free range we get to make this thing our own. And that's what's important at this stage, is trying to start figuring that out for yourself.
Yeah, in the learning stage, it's like, you're trying so hard to make something work, and you've always got to remember in the back of your head, this is a skill. It takes time and practice, and a lot of time and practice, but it will come together. The more you do it, the more it becomes natural. And you may go, I don't really ever need top-down mixing ever again, because you kind of understand how everything works. But every song is different. Every project is different. So it's another tool in the toolbox that, if you find yourself kind of getting stumped, like, these elements just aren't fitting together, try it the opposite way, see if it works. But yeah, you'll build your style. It's just
And
gonna take time.
if you don't even know where to start, do the same mix a couple different ways. Take a different order of operations each time, refine the mix to the best of your ability, bounce it out, set them all up and A/B against them, and make an honest assessment, and then go from there.
Cool. Some EQ strategies, and this is a couple things that we actually see quite a bit. High-pass filtering. I'll let you talk about this.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so I run a mastering house when I'm not here, and the most common thing I reject mixes for is just overzealous high-pass filtering, especially, obviously, on the kick drum and the bass. There's been kind of information circling the, social media groups and YouTube channels saying, oh, you got to get rid of everything below X frequency, some magic frequency that you need to just eradicate everything.
It's always the magic frequency of something.
And it's always this kind of, boogeyman element that, it's going to muddy up your mix and it's just wasting your headroom. The thing you find once you have a sound system that expresses down to 20 hertz is how often there's pretty much nothing down that low. And there's a very real potential when you're using near fields, especially without a sub, that you might accidentally cut out the meat of your kick drum by high passing it at some arbitrary frequency, because they go quite low. It's essentially a noise generator and a sine sweep, if you in synthesis terms.
Yeah.
And quite often there's meaningful stuff down there that you miss once you take it off, but most sound systems, you don't really appreciate it. We deliberate over this stuff for hours in mastering. Oh, do we want to high pass it at 15 hertz, 18 hertz, 17.5? If you don't have a sound system that goes that low, err on the side of caution, because I see people go way too far with this here and at my mastering house.
Now, there's a case for it in some instances. We talked about
Totally.
noise before, like if there's a mic rattle in a vocal track, and you can kind of see that the vocals, there's really no energy if you're looking at a frequency analyzer up to say 80 hertz, we'll just say.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, you could do some high-pass filtering up to that to try to eliminate that. There's nothing wrong with that. But like Matt said, it's, you kind of need to understand how everything works. And there's no magic frequency for everything because every song
Unfortunately.
is different. So just because this song's kick drum has all of its energy gone at 45 hertz, you know, this one may not. This one may go all the way down into like
The center
15,
of the earth.
yeah, 15 hertz. So, and it can change the character of a song.
Yeah.
So you have to be very, very careful about high pass filtering or applying the low cut filter to everything. So just be wary that, you know, if you're going to use it, it's another tool in the toolbox that can be used. Is it absolutely necessary in everything? No. So, you know, we'll just leave it at that.
Now, don't get me wrong. If there's 60 cycle hum in your flute solo, yes, by all means, high pass that. I'm just saying.
If you've got 60 cycle hum in your flute solo, you've got worse problems
probably
than
should
high pass
go.
filtering. So when using an EQ, one of the things we talk about is sweeping, where essentially you'll take an EQ band, jack it up as far as it will go, well, not as far as it will go, but pretty loud, and move it around kind of listening for a particular resonant frequency that might be problematic, occasionally that you might want to enhance. When you are done doing that, please take it back down. It doesn't have to be to such extreme levels. Now with parametric EQs, there's an effect called ringing. And it's where essentially the resonance or the Q is so high that it actually causes the filter to feed back on itself. And this can be an audible ringing effect. It happens sometimes, it is pretty rare, but I've heard some projects where a student will just jack up the EQ because, hey, I really want to boost this. And remember with EQing, you cannot boost something that is not there. So, you know, trying to bring up a frequency that doesn't exist in the bass or in the high end or whatever. And it's an audible ringing that can be heard over this. So if you're going to do that, always remember just turn it down. Probably a good idea to, as you're doing that, just to back things off a bit anyway.
I mean, the big motive for notch filters in the first place is to attenuate ringing, you know, and usually it's in elements like snare drums, whistle tones, and vocals, things where it's an intrusive element or an element that impacts the decay time of the instrument in a way that, you know, is bad for your mix. So I can't really think of a good justifiable reason to ever use a boosting notch outside of sound design purposes.
Yeah,
that is
again,
that is the case, but
there's a
not in
reason-
mixing.
Yeah, sorry, there's a reason for everything, but again, just judicious use of it. If something sounds off when that EQ is on and you power it off in the DAW, or if it's hardware, you know, turn it down,
Bypass it.
and it's gone, you're like, oh, wait a minute, maybe there's a little too much in there. So again, you know, use your ears. Okay, effects. I hear quite a few mixes where I think everybody's a little more heavy-handed on the creative effects than probably needs to be. So I'd just like to say that sometimes a little bit, remember, a little goes a long way. If you're trying to glue together, you know, different elements in a mix, a small amount of compression or room tone, you know, can pull that together. Too much can make it sound like it's coming from another planet or another room. So be very, very judicious with reverb, especially on a main vocal, because this was big in the 80s, I know, because I was there, but yeah, we don't really need super big reverbs coming off of the vocals. Very, very few songs I've heard today really hold up to that. But yeah, just think about, is it pulling everything together, or is it making it sound like a completely different instrument, totally separate from the rest of what's being mixed? Another thing I have with delay can be a very, very powerful tool. It can also get a bit repetitive. I have a lot of students who will do delay on a particular instrument. It could be vocals, it could be a drum, or really anything, where that delay happens every X number of bars. So it's kind of a cool effect, and then it becomes a repetitive kind of effect. And if the artist had really wanted it, they probably would have done it in production. But one of the problems I have with it is it becomes distracting. It can pull you away from the main emphasis of the song, whether it's the vocals or the guitar, keyboards, or any other melodic element, especially something like ping pong, where you've got delays kind of going like this constantly. Your ears are being pulled around. Your focus is now pulled away from the true intent that the artist wanted, which is to convey this melody or this harmony or this vocal line. So be careful with that.
Yeah, I like to tell my students that the effects should never become the feature of the song. Like if a lay person is listening to a piece of music and the thing that they gravitate to is the amount of reverb you've used on it, you've fundamentally failed as a mixer at that point. That is definitely a step too far. And I mean, to add to that, from a really pragmatic point of view, we live in an era, for better or worse, where loudness potential is of paramount importance. Every time-based effect you add to a mix adds spectral masking by default. That's the core of what it does. It ambiguates the signal over time. And when you do that, it puts it in a position to mask the other elements in the mix. They get in each other's way. The core of...
Can create a real kind of muddiness,
Yeah,
if you
exactly,
will.
because things are fighting for the same space. The key component in loudness potential is mitigating and minimizing spectral masking. If mix elements inhabit one space in the frequency range at a time, and they don't step on each other's toes, that's a mix that will naturally sound louder. That's called acoustic advantage in the mastering community. But the more reverb and delay you add to your mix, first of all, you're going to lose your presence and your punch by default. But on top of that, you're minimizing how upfront and in your face that mix is going to be, and whether we like it or not, that's kind of what people want right now.
Yeah, and again, it's if the artist had wanted something like that, and there are genres that are bathing in reverb.
Oh, totally.
Or
Shoegaze.
delay is used to extremely creative effects. They will do that in production.
Yep.
That will come with the tracks that come to you.
Or they'll give you very specific notes about it.
Exactly, which is kind of the last thing on here. I mean, if you have an idea to do some kind of deep creative effect or something really out of the ordinary, double check with the artist to see if they're cool with it, because they might want to reference, like, send me a 30-second snippet of what you're thinking of. Then it's a quick, create, bounce, send it to them, and then they give you a yes or a no before you move on. Saves you time, might save you a job.
Yeah, if you absolutely have to be ambitious with what you're doing, it helps to get in front of it in order to not thoroughly spook your client away, Brief them with your intentions before you play it for them. That helps a lot.
All right. Let me take a step here. Rick, do we have any questions? So we got, how much, are we okay on time? Good on time?
We're good on time.
We're good on time, cool. All right, let's move ahead then. All right, some final tips and tricks that we kind of came up with. And this one, yes, thanks to you for reminding me. Soloing is a powerful tool. And again, like I said, typically when I'm going through a mix for the first time, after listening to it, 1, 2, 3, or however many times I want to, that's when I'll go through and solo individual tracks. It is very rare that I would solo something while actually working on a mix. So essentially the only time you would solo something while you're mixing is you've encountered a problem. You found an issue or you're trying to track something down. Always, always, always try to mix as a complete track as possible, because then you get kind of the full idea and the full extent of what the song is, and you're mixing it as a complete whole.
Or at least sensible groups of tracks.
Exactly,
your
yeah.
rhythmic section,
You
your
can wind up-
melodic section.
Yeah, you can wind up going down rabbit holes if
Oh, totally.
you wind up chasing something, soloing it, then you wind up doing EQ, you unsolo it, and it's
terrible.
just, you're like, whoa, what happened? Now you've got to retrace your steps. Mono, checking a mix in mono when you're getting to kind of an endpoint is a great way to make sure that phases align. Other issues with any kind of time-based effects can pop up there too. Always remember to uncheck the mono button.
Especially before you bounce it.
Yeah, before you send it out. I have received quite a few mixes that are just flat mono. In fact, I'll pull up a coralometer and there's no information left or right whatsoever, even though it's a 2-track file. So again, it could be an accidental, and it's a great way, again, to kind of check for things and make sure things work, that you don't have kind of any major phase issues. But yeah, before you hit that bounce button, make sure you're still in stereo mode, or if you're doing surround mode.
See it all the time.
Yeah, it does happen. Normalization. And as you said, never ever normalize a track. I totally agree. Now this has only happened to, at least me with a student work, once. But yeah, some DAWs in the bounce window logic actually used to have this on by default. Oh, thankfully they turned it off. It would normalize your bounced file by default, which would just destroy it. It's just useless. So it's going to maximize all the bits. Just no. Just absolutely no. Absolutely no. Referencing. We've talked about referencing against other tracks. We do in mastering. This is an absolute must. But even in mixing is a very, very good idea.
I would argue it's a lot more valuable in mixing even than mastering, because a lot of the choices that are made in mixing are set in stone by the mastering stage, and I think a lot of more of what a mix can become is obviously defined in that stage. Things like balances between instruments, and broad strokes, tonal work. It's important, especially when you're learning to reference against other tracks. Obviously, you'll probably only have access to mastered tracks, but just pull them down.
I was about to say,
pull them down 6, 8, 10 dB and compare.
Yeah, I do talk about level matching a little bit within my course, but yeah, it's a very good point that especially in the learning stage, understanding what a good mix sounds like is something to attain to. It's kind of like mentoring, kind of trying to replicate what has already been done. Yes, they're going to be absolute mastered, completed, near perfect works, but yeah, you can bring the level down a little bit and at least get an idea for balance and spatial, and how the instruments fit together and how elements are pulled in and out.
People love to talk about translation, and a lot of what that boils down to is just your mix balances, just having elements in the right level in relation to each other. So much of that, is from mix balance. And that's what you can learn a lot about from referencing mixes that you know are good. The important thing is you have to pick good reference tracks against the material you're working on. It has to have a similar arrangement, a similar density. You can't compare a mix that's very dense with mix elements to something that's, a trio, because it's just a poor comparison.
Probably want to make sure it's within kind of the same
genre. Yeah, that might be good.
Yeah. Cool. And one of the things that I kind of talk about is, and this kind of goes back to a couple things that we've talked about as far as checking for things, referencing on other systems, and that can be something as simple as a set of headphones. The speakers that everyone gets are good and certainly usable, but headphones can help you find things like they can extend that low frequency down or even isolate higher frequencies. It's not going to probably be as spatially accurate as actual sound moving from your speakers, but I'll tell you what, it's a really good way to find out issues and problems, not only with individual tracks, but even within a complete mix. And I always recommend, at least for students who are doing mastering, to reference on everything you can get your hands on, because while you're learning and understanding your monitors and your room as well, because a room is really the biggest part of it.
Oh yeah.
Trying to get something that works on everything you can find, from a boombox to your car stereo to your speakers to headphones. If you can get a mix that sounds good on all of those, it's probably going to be pretty stunning by the time it hits larger speakers.
This is our biggest hurdle in the mixing and mastering, is this little guy right here. Like, this is the end all be all right now, unfortunately.
By phone, phone speakers.
Phone speakers. I wish it hadn't come to this, but here we are. And yeah, if you can get it to sound good on a phone speaker, that's the new NS10.
Wow. Yeah. I don't know if I'm up for that.
This has gotten really nihilistic. I'm sorry.
All right, a couple of the last things here. Again, I said I mix fairly low, and I still kind of think that mixing at lower volumes gives you kind of a better sense of how things work together. There's a thing called compression, essentially where your ears will compress as you start bringing up the volume more and more and more, because you want to do it louder to our ears is better. It's just how our hearing works. So to try to get more detail, right, or at least listen for more detail out of a mix, you'll take the volume up and then up some more and up some more. And soon you're to a point where your ears are ringing.
There's a lot of complicating factors in this equation. One is your ears compress. They're transducers. They have an excursion limit. Beyond that, they start distorting.
Excursion limit being, like, think of
How
a
far
speaker,
it
like
can
how a
move.
speaker moves
Just like
in
a
and out.
speaker.
Yeah.
Our eardrums work the same way, but in reverse. Secondarily, the drivers of your speakers or your headphones, they're also transducers. They have an excursion limit beyond which point they start distorting, and beyond which point the transients are no longer being represented properly. I like to tell my students when they're learning how to use compressors, mix at a really low level, because the transients will be better expressed if they aren't being compressed by the driver of the speaker. On top of that, you've got Fletcher Bunsen, where the louder you listen to it, the more your low end and top end sensitivity gives. There's a lot of moving parts in this equation, and the best way to mitigate it is to mix at every level. Just switch between levels. Make sure it sounds reasonably good at all of them. If they sound, decent, quiet, regular level, and loud, you're probably in the ballpark.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, again, it's just a good idea, especially if you're going to be mixing for long periods of time, which you're going to do while you're learning. It's what you're kind of trying to do, whether you're creating your own work or working with somebody else's.
Oh, and also, sorry.
It's okay.
And also, it sounds really stupid, but it's the greatest technique I've learned in the last couple of years. You're going to become desensitized to what you're listening to. Your ears are going to become fatigued. Your brain is also going to become fatigued. It's going to be so tired of listening to the same song over and over, because that's not what we're designed to do as humans. A good way to get around that is to just put the music on at a reasonably low level and just completely ignore it. Just, scroll through Instagram or whatever.
Passive listening.
Odds are something will jump out at you that you didn't notice before, and that's because your conscious mind is tuned out to the process, but your subconscious mind is taken over. I use that all the time in mastering.
I use it actually quite a bit too, usually for something I'm trying to mix on my own, which I don't recommend to do. But sometimes just having, walking away from it, like you said. I mean, I put in here of like, take breaks, take frequent breaks. You'll understand as you continue to do this, and again, whether you're working on your own music or others, you will feel your ears like you just can't hear detail anymore. You've hit that compression point, stop. Don't continue to push because you're just hitting a point of diminishing return. Take a break, go walk around, and whether you want to kind of put it on low in the background at that point or go get a cup of tea or coffee or water or whatever, take a walk around, and then come back and listen to it kind of passively. I'll do this while I'm cleaning up, like while I'm doing laundry or cleaning the house or the studio or whatever. Because, yeah, things will pop, it's strange, things will pop out at you.
It sounds so dumb,
that
but it works.
you didn't expect before. Or you'll actually be like, whoa, that actually really works. So it kind of works on both aspects. Kind of the last thing I wanted to talk about here,
biggest
and this is the
one.
biggest one while it's in all caps. So for anybody downloading the PDF, read the last one first. Very last thing. When you are done and you have created your mix, and whether it's for one of the classes here at Full Sail or for a client you're just excited to work with, always, 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 always listen to that final bounce at least once. I would
From
recommend
beginning to end, to
dozens
make
of
sure you don't
times.
cut the reverb tail
Yes,
off at the end.
listen to it before you send it off to the client. And that client could be Matt, it could be myself, it could be any of the other, instructors here at Full Sail. It could be your client. Yeah, if that reverb tail is cut off.
I can't
If there is a audible, like it goes into distortion in the guitar solo after the second chorus. If something gets cut off at the beginning, if there's noise at the beginning of it, if there's too much tail, right? Dead space at the end of it. These can be deal breakers for a client. They're like, wait a second. Because they're really, really simple things to fix.
Yep.
And you can only fix them by making sure that that product is 100% the best you can make it before you ship it out. Always listen to what you're about to send out, whether it's a piece of student work or the best thing you've ever done, okay? All righty. Gentlemen,
Got
Rick,
questions?
Derek, do we have any questions back there? Go back to our beginning here. We're good. Well, okay. Well, I guess we will call that good today. Matt, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Again, I'd like to thank Rick and Derek for manning the questions back there. Big thanks to Omar and Susan and all of the students here in ShowPro for helping us out doing this today. Could not have done this without your help, and thank you very much. And thank you for joining another AP Town Hall, and we will see you soon. Awesome.